It is Thursday, and that means it's time for Caroline Heldman, professor of critical theory and social justice at Occidental College. She is here to break down this week's political headlines. Good morning, Caroline.
Good morning, Giselle. Great to see you.
Yeah, I mean, the horrific atrocities continue to just shock the world coming out of Ukraine. And when you look back at what happened in Bosnia with Milosevic and that genocide and how that war was finally stopped, what can we learn from that could apply to what we're going through right now?
Well, I think the big lesson from that is that it took years to prosecute war crimes, that it was a tedious task, and that if folks are expecting to have, some sort of immediate relief or justice for what appear to be war crimes, the murder of civilians, the rape of civilians, the torture of civilians, that it will actually take many years to hold those responsible accountable for that.
But what stopped the actual, atrocities, Caroline? Did the U.S. have to drop bombs to finally end that war?
Well, yes, it wasn't the U.S., but there was definitely a very severe military response to the murder of 8,000 civilians at one point. So there was a point in the war where we just couldn't, the international world just couldn't ignore it anymore. The issue here, though, is that the U.S. and NATO are desperately trying to stay out of World War III. And just to break it down simply, right now the war is between Russia and Ukraine is backed by NATO and the EU and the US. But if we go and we take action, then it becomes Russia versus the rest of the world. And that is what, folks, this dance, this very delicate dance, that's what we're trying to avoid with what's happening right now by backing up Ukraine instead of going in directly.
But isn't it just semantics? Aren't we already there? I mean, General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, signaled that there's real danger ahead, said this is already going to get worse with the potential to grow into that war. So are we not already there?
We're not already there, and that Putin hasn't recognized what the U.S. and NATO and the EU are doing as acts of war. So he has not recognized that. If he were to recognize that, and if we put him in a position to recognize that, I think what happens next is unpredictable and far worse. Right now, it's being concentrated, his war efforts are being concentrated on Ukraine. If we were in World War III, it would extend beyond those borders, and that is what folks are desperately trying to avoid.
Well, President Zelensky, in another impassioned plea to the UN Security Council, asked, why does the Council even exist if it can't exercise its most basic intent to keep peace? Says Russia should be expelled from that body, but nothing is done. So what is the use of this council?
Well, the UN actually is considering removing Russia from its Human Rights Commission, right? They are taking a stand, but Zelensky has a really good point. The UN is essentially a diplomatic body, though, and having Russia at the table for diplomacy for a very long time has probably staved off some of these actions. Now, right now, they don't have any real ability to hold Russia accountable. Again, just a diplomatic body, but an important one that has generally kept the peace in many instances where peace simply would not have been possible otherwise.
Let me ask you about some stuff happening closer to home. Ivanka Trump, following her husband Jared Kushner, testified before the January 6th committee, blowing any privilege others like Bannon have claimed they have. From the reporting, it was substantive. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's interesting. We know also from the interview with Trump that Ivanka and Jared Kushner refused executive privilege when he offered it to him when he was in office, according to Trump. So it does appear that folks around Trump are willing to speak, and maybe they're willing to speak because they don't have the goods to share. It's possible that Trump's inner circle is not speaking simply because there's just plenty of evidence there, as this federal court judge found last week, that it's more likely than not that Trump and others, John Eastman, his attorney, it's more likely than not that they did commit some felonies.
There's a new exclusive interview with the former president this morning in the Washington Post. The former president deflects blame for January 6th, blames it on Pelosi, denies any knowledge of removing call logs. But there was an even more interesting headline coming out of a meeting I guess he had with historians where he said that he admitted to losing the 2020 election. What do you make of that?
Well, it's interesting. He's talking out both sides of his mouth, right? So Trump is still very much pushing the big lie at rallies and around the country, but acknowledges that he lost the election. Who knows whether or not that will kind of pierce the consciousness of about 30% of Americans who believe the big lie. But this was a really interesting interview with Trump, the first, right, since January 6th. In which also he expresses remorse about not going to the Capitol, not marching to the Capitol. So, on one hand, he's acknowledging that he lost. On the other hand, he's kind of pouring gasoline on the flames of this idea that January 6th was okay when it was a violent insurrection.
I have to let you go. We only have 30 seconds, but it is a historic day today, isn't it?
It certainly is. Ketanji Brown Jackson will be confirmed for the Supreme Court with the support possibly from three Republican senators, first Black woman on the court, the most qualified in the recent political era.
Caroline Heldman, as always, thank you so much for your vital perspective. We'll see you next Thursday and perhaps even before. This is your Morning on Spectrum News 1. We'll be right back, everyone. Thanks, Caroline.